to some degree, we're all wrong, right? To some degree that no matter what you believe about the world, you're going to need to leave space to change that belief, because we're always getting new information. The world is always changing. Interpretations are always changing, and new evidence presents itself. So we want to make sure we're leaving space for that, because to be really dogmatic in a particular position, to hold that dogmatism makes you inflexible, makes you unwilling to truly listen to what other people are saying. The Bible doesn't say a lot about Nephilim. This is in Genesis chapter 6. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown."
As I was riding along the road on my mule, I suddenly noticed a very strange person walking beside me. His head was about even with my shoulders as I sat in my saddle. He wore no clothing, but was covered with hair. His skin was very dark. I asked him where he dwelt, and he replied that he had no home, and that he was a wanderer in the earth and traveled to and fro. He said he was a very miserable creature, and his mission was to destroy the souls of men. I'd like to welcome Nathan to Bigfoot Crossroads. We're going to talk about an aspect of Bigfoot and the unexplained that it's something that interested me for a long time. You certainly hear a lot about it. It's kind of a certain, I guess, a belief system at this point, whenever it comes to these subjects, especially in regards to Bigfoot. But we're going to finally talk about the idea of Bigfoot being Nephilim from the Bible, or possibly demonic in nature. Nathan, first of all, welcome to Bigfoot Crossroads. Thanks for joining me.
Great to be here, Matt. Really looking forward to this. I've had it on my calendar for a while, and I just can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, so I met you through a mutual friend, DJ, who's also been on the show. You co-host a podcast with him called Calling All Beans, and that's beans as in beans, not beans as in what you put in chili, for anyone that...
If you make a good chili, though, we're all about it. Bring it.
Yeah, sure. Calling All Beans. But you guys, what I thought was a UFO podcast is really much more than a UFO podcast. Would you mind just telling people what that podcast is about a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been doing Calling All Beings now for a couple of years, and DJ and I met really kind of by accident. He used to do podcasting focused on the NBA and MMA. I had never podcasted before at all, but I had a strong interest in the UFO phenomena. And so through just a series of random accidents, we got connected to each other and decided to create a podcast together. And we wanted to have a space where we could talk about UFOs, talk about the paranormal, talk about Bigfoot, talk about weird things that people experience in their life, and have that be a space that can be comfortable and welcoming and validating and also thought-provoking. So we try very hard to have a good time on the show, to make space for weird things and weird ideas. We bring on some folks that neither he nor I necessarily always agree with, but the goal is just to have an interesting conversation. And the best way to do that, at least for us, was to do that through a podcast, particularly when you live in a world now where we can easily connect with folks from everywhere through these digital tools. So we're doing that, and it has taken us into some interesting territory. Certainly not the traditional UFO only focused podcast. We're looking at that wide range of phenomenological experience. And I think that's important because for me, at least personally, if you can't have an approach to reality that tries to incorporate or make sense of the weird things that are happening in human experience, then you're just by default, you're leaving something out. So we're trying not to leave something out. We're trying to cast a wide net and try to make sense of that. And it's difficult, particularly if you want to sort of pigeonhole everything into one theory, which we try hard not to do. So we're kind of doing a wide collection and having fun talking about it and leaving space for different theories, different ideas, different guests. It's a fun format, and we're really kind of just getting started, even though we just finished our 102nd episode.
Yeah, congratulations on reaching that 100th episode milestone and just cruising right on by it.
Yeah, thanks.
You know, I've spent some time sitting in with you guys on the podcast, and it was an amazing experience for me. First off, being able to kind of put my feet up and relax a bit whenever I'm on a podcast. Don't get to do that much whenever you're hosting, but you guys really do a fantastic job of keeping an open dialogue and allowing people to express their beliefs and their theories and their opinions without making them feel defensive or challenged by expressing those things. And that's very difficult to do because these topics can be very personal, I think, to people. And because of that, they form their own opinions and theories and their own beliefs, and they get kind of caught in that rut of just staying in that lane and putting those blinders on, and in turn, a lot of times get angry whenever somebody challenges that. But on your show, like I said, you do a great job of having that open dialogue where people don't get into those areas and get the feelings hurt and turn it into a brawl on air like it happens a lot of times in other areas.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We do try hard to do that. It's not easy all the time. Sometimes you have to kind of smile through it if you're hearing something that you strongly disagree with. And that's not to say that we're not willing to have a constructive dialogue about it. I think we are willing to do that. But there's a recognition that we have anyway that to some degree we're all wrong, right? To some degree that no matter what you believe about the world, you're going to need to leave space to change that belief, because we're always getting new information. The world is always changing. Interpretations are always changing, and new evidence presents itself. So we want to make sure we're leaving space for that, because to be really dogmatic in a particular position, at least this is my position, to hold that dogmatism makes you inflexible, makes you unwilling to truly listen to what other people are saying. And that's something that we're really lacking a lot of in the world today, listening. We're really wanting to get our points in and not listen to what others are saying. So we're trying hard to do that, to listen first and get into a dialogue and hopefully grow in that process of exchange.
So DJ found me through the Bigfoot world, listening to the podcast and just being DJ and not being bashful at all and just reaching out and talking to him. Mm-hmm. Now, if I remember correctly, DJ actually got into Bigfoot stuff because of you.
That's right. So I apologize.
Yeah, thanks for unleashing him on the Bigfoot world.
Force of nature. Yep.
But, you know, it wouldn't be fair of me to do a Bigfoot podcast without asking why the interest in Bigfoot on your part.
That's a really good question. It's something a lot like UFOs in the sense that it's not something I had a lifelong interest in. Certainly as a young person, I was fascinated by stories about Bigfoot. I've not had a Bigfoot experience myself. I've been camping, been out in the wilderness, never had something happen that I could kind of put into that bucket. But I was fascinated by these stories that were shared in my childhood, both in literature that I'd pick up from the school library and also on TV. You know, those episodes that we all kind of grew up with of mysterious things that had been reported in the world. And I kind of did what a lot of people do. You know, you have that fascination. You put it kind of back on the shelf as you get a little bit older, unless you have a personal experience with it. That's kind of where it stays. Well, getting into UFOs, for me, some correlation here is that I take very seriously what people say, and doesn't mean I take it at face value, but I do take it seriously. And when I know people who've had experiences, whether they've had an experience of something strange in the sky, or strange beside their bed, or strange in the forest, and I know these people personally, and I know their character, their history, I take it very seriously. I think you have to. There was certainly a time in my life where I didn't do that, and I would kind of brush it off. And I think we're all pretty good about brushing off things that sort of fall outside that consensus reality that we all share. You know, that doesn't make sense for me. Nobody that I know has that experience, so therefore it cannot be true.
Right.
Let me just ignore what you just said. That's kind of what we typically do, right? But I had someone that shared an experience with me, a very profound one that he had, and I couldn't ignore it. And he then sent me an episode. I forget exactly which one it was, or what show it was on, but it was about the vocalizations. And it was about the man who had the training in languages,
mm-hmm.
and listening to these vocalizations. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, and your listeners probably do as well. I mean, it was absolutely riveting to me just listening to that content. And so I was in the airport when I was listening to this episode, coming back from a trip, and I sent that to DJ, and I was like, "You got to listen to this, man. This is intense." And he has caught the bug even bigger than I had it, man. He, as you know, he is Bigfoot all the way, gassed down. He's very into it.
Yeah, for sure. Contacts me several times a week to have me either listen to something or ask me about someone or a story, get my take on it. You know, which, geez, I feel like the bitter old man sometimes, you know, having been involved in this for so long, and you know, you build up pretty strong calluses whenever it comes to anecdotal stories and podcast episodes. And it's just like, I don't always give him the opinion that he wants to hear, which has led to some fantastic debates. But I'm glad that I've met DJ in a time of my life whenever I have, because honestly, 10 years ago, I would have just said, "Hey, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. I know more than you. Shut up." Now, sometimes he does get me to start thinking about things and looking at things from a different perspective, and kind of opens my eyes a bit. So it's nice to have people like DJ take an interest in the subject, who aren't viewing it, you know, with just a negative angle all the time, and allowing for conversations to take place. So I'm glad you introduced him to the topic. All kidding aside, I'm glad he reached out to me. I've become very good friends with him. I consider you a friend. I feel very benefited by the introductions that he has made in my life and the input he has added. But enough about DJ. Jeez.
Yeah, exactly. He's going to listen to this too, you know, so we got to stop inflating his ego. Yeah.
So, yeah, whenever you're talking about people being firm in their beliefs and not wanting to listen, and it doesn't get any more so than whenever it comes to religion. It's such a strong topic for people, an emotional topic. It's to me, always been a dangerous area to discuss openly, at least. Over the recent years, it has started becoming more and more popular in the Bigfoot world. I even see comments on my own episodes where I'm not talking about anything religious. I'm not proposing anything. And I see in the comments sometimes people saying, these things are demons, or these things are this, and just making these matter-of-fact statements. And whenever it comes to that stuff, I do consider myself a Christian. That's my own personal faith. I don't talk about it a lot on the podcast. But I will be the first one to admit that whenever it comes to specific things in the Bible and certain questions and things, a lot of times my opinions don't line up with fellow Christians in terms of interpretation and what certain things mean. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to default to someone like yourself. So starting out, if you don't mind, could you give a little bit of your background in terms of religious studies and everything as it pertains to this subject matter, and why I might have someone like you on the podcast to talk about this?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I grew up in a Christian family. My father was a Baptist minister. So I like to joke that before I was born, I was going to church Sundays and Wednesdays every week. And, so I grew up in that culture, being a fixture of the church and heavily involved, doing all the youth group activities and choir. And I mean, I was all in the church life. My dad, I mentioned he was a Baptist minister. Not many folks realize that the Baptist tradition in the United States has kind of a complex history. And in the late 1970s, I guess this was probably right around before I was born, there was a sort of schism in the Baptist denomination in the U.S. Between kind of the more fundamentalist Baptists and those who I guess would call themselves progressive Baptists, or more liberal Baptist-minded folks. Anyway, I bring that up because my father, when he went to seminary, got his degree. He has a PhD in New Testament, so he got his degree from a Baptist institution. But that institution was more firmly within the progressive liberal perspective. And when this schism took place, the church really sort of fragmented. The leadership changed within the denomination to more of that fundamentalist perspective. And that was kind of a pretty sad moment in his life. And I think from then on had to deal with the consequences of a Baptist community that not always understood its past, but was wrestling with some of those issues below the surface, sometimes on the surface. So I grew up in that context, going to church regularly, but getting a very kind of academic perspective on the faith. My dad can read the Greek New Testament, so I would always get interesting tidbits about, well, in the Greek, this is what it means. And it's a little bit more sort of robust than it is in the English translation. And we'll get into some of that too, I think, when we talk about the Nephilim. So that was my childhood. Went to school, got a degree in finance, totally unrelated to religion, but very practical. And I figured I should have something that would be useful in the world. But as I kind of got toward the end of my college experience, I really felt like I needed to understand my faith in a deeper way. I felt, if you're a Christian, I felt called to pursue that further. So I went to seminary after I finished my undergraduate. So I went to a Baptist seminary in Georgia, but a progressive Baptist seminary. And my professors were, in some cases, colleagues of my father, who went to the same schools that he went to, and even some of his own professors were teaching me. So it was a small seminary, and we got that kind of education. And I really enjoyed it. I love talking about religion, theology, ideas, philosophy. But I realized pretty early on into that experience that the Christianity that I thought was so important to me was, kind of one aspect of a larger picture. When you study Christian theology, you realize that what these theologians are doing over the centuries is they're taking the world that they live in and the world that they were born in, and they're trying to bring the Christian text into that world and really translate it in a way that the world of their day can understand.
Right.
So these theologies, some of which, if you are a Christian believer, no matter what church you go to or denomination you go to, you have a theological perspective that is influenced by these thinkers in the past. And a lot of people don't think that. They think, oh, well, no, that's not true. I just look at the Bible and that's my theology. But the reality is there's very much a cultural, sort of lensing happening between you and the text. And that's something that we cannot really escape. We're going to try, and many people try through various different means and methods, but that is truly inescapable. So we're bringing ourselves into the conversation with that material. That's just what we do. So I left the church behind. It wasn't something that I felt like I needed to continue to pursue, and just got a normal career, which I've had now for quite some time, almost 20 years. And oddly enough, the UFO topic has kind of brought me back into and helped me sort of reclaim or redeem aspects of my religious upbringing. I don't consider myself to be Christian now, but I do absolutely make more room for Christianity and the perspective of Christianity in my worldview. So my history is a little bit complex there. I wouldn't call myself a believer in the traditional sense, but I also acknowledge that there are aspects of Christian belief that I believe are quite true. So again, all part of that larger story, which we're all trying to figure out.
My introduction to this theory or belief, whatever you want to call it, behind Bigfoot being one of these biblical entities was a story that I heard very early on. It was actually the Mormon church that started this belief, believe it or not. And I actually found the story. So let me read that real fast. It comes from a church apostle by the name of David Patton, when he described an encounter he had with Cain in 1835. So that's a long time ago, especially for Bigfoot information. As I was riding along the road on my mule, I suddenly noticed a very strange person walking beside me. His head was about even with my shoulders as I sat in my saddle. He wore no clothing, but was covered with hair. His skin was very dark. I asked him where he dwelt, and he replied that he had no home, and that he was a wanderer in the earth and traveled to and fro. He said he was a very miserable creature, and his mission was to destroy the souls of men. So this apostle is talking about Cain, based on his belief and everything. And this entry was included in Spencer W. Campbell's The Miracle of Forgiveness, which was originally published in 1969. So here's where it gets interesting. In 1980, there were actually sightings of Bigfoot reported in South Weber, Utah. So basically, the Mormons, the Mormon community in Utah at the time of those sightings in 1980, made the connection between Bigfoot and the description of Bigfoot to what this apostle described as his meeting with Cain. And thus, the idea of Bigfoot being Cain, Bigfoot being included in the Bible, Bigfoot being evil was born. The Mormon church definitely wanted a way to say, oh, well, Satan is doing this. Satan is behind this. He's coming after us. So that means we're doing something right. That means our, religion is confirmed based on the actions of Satan. So that's actually where it came from, a story from an apostle in 1835 in the Mormon Church. It was just a story. It was an interesting one, but it didn't have any traction, really. I never heard anyone talking about it or anything until, I would say, within the past 5 years or so. It has become a very popular belief that Bigfoot are biblical and evil in nature. So my first question in regards to Bigfoot being Nephilim, whatever the correct pronunciation is, what does the Bible actually say about them? Like, is this something that does the descriptions actually match Bigfoot in your opinion?
Well, no. The Bible doesn't say a lot about Nephilim. They're not mentioned often in the Bible, but I do have some passages that I think we should read and get into a little bit related to the mention of the Nephilim. But in no example that I'm about to read are they described as covered in hair. And even the link between these Nephilim and Cain is a little bit tenuous at best. I also find it interesting that in the Apostles story that you shared, it's a very sort of like just kind of not cordial, but calm conversation he's having with this being on the side of the road who's apparently meant to torment human beings. So not a lot of tormenting happening there, just more of a conversation, but nevertheless a fascinating account. So why don't I start with the first instance of where the Nephilim are mentioned in the Bible, and that's in the book of Genesis. So very early on. For those of you who don't know, that's the first book.
That's the first part.
So Genesis, that's the very first one. So this is in Genesis chapter 6, and I'm going to read the first 4 verses of this chapter. And the translation that I'm using is the New Revised Standard Version. So for those of you who care about those things. All right, so it starts, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown." All right, so there's a lot to unpack in that little passage there. And there's some, I think, fairly clear ambiguity. Do you kind of put those two words together? It's not clear what the Nephilim actually are in this passage. So we know that it mentions the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. This was, by the way, right before the flood happened. This was right before Noah was building the ark, and the flood came along in that passage. So they were on the earth. They were on the earth in those days and afterward. But separately, it says, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. So it's not necessarily clear that the Nephilim are also these sons of God who went and had children with the daughters of humans. Right. So there's a little bit of, it's not clear there. Some people like to make those two things the same.
Right.
But if you really look at it, it's not entirely clear. Then it says, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. So that phrase seems to be related to the children who were born to the women and the sons of God, not necessarily to these Nephilim. So again, these Nephilim kind of stand on their own to some degree. So that's the first passage. Before we get to the second one, I want to talk a little bit about the word Nephilim and how it's sort of translated or understood. So it's a Hebrew word, and when it was when the Hebrew text was translated into Greek, this happened in some people think the 3rd, 2nd century before Christ. So before the Common Era, if you want to use a different way of saying it. And the reason why the Bible was translated into Greek at that time is that the rulers of the day, they decided they wanted to have this text, but they wanted to have it in a language that they could read. Hebrew was not a widely used language at that time. It was a Greek sort of cultural world at that point, and the phrase for that is Hellenism. So Hellenism was sort of the culture of the region of the world. And if you're in that region, you're sort of steeped in Greek culture in various different ways, even if you come from other traditions that aren't at their beginning Greek in nature. So Greek ways of thinking, Greek philosophy, Greek mythology permeates all these aspects of culture in that Mediterranean basin where these things are happening. And so the ruler of the day apparently decided to gather up these Hebrew scholars, these Hebrew elders. And the saying is that he basically got 6 scholars from the 12 tribes of Israel, so 72 Hebrew scholars who could translate into Greek, into Koine Greek, which is the common Greek that was used at the time. And he just sort of asked them all to create translations of the Hebrew text. And he asked them to do this sort of separately. And so the mythology here is they were all doing this separately, and they all kind of came to similar translations. All right, so why do I bring all that up? I bring that up because the word Nephilim in Hebrew tends to have a connotation of fallen or fallen ones or causing ones to fall. Right? So it's interesting. There's a fall component with that word. But when they did the translation into Greek, they're thinking about that Hellenistic culture I just mentioned. And the only thing that they could kind of come up with as a parallel to this fallen notion is sort of this idea of giants. These, in Greek and mythology, you've got these kinds of titans and giants. And that's the sort of parallel that was made then between Nephilim being fallen and Nephilim being giants. Right? So that kind of stuck a little bit. And obviously we're talking about it because it did. There's that giant connotation there.
I mean, how many stories in Greek mythology do you have where, a god basically mated with a human and produced, this half hybrid offspring that was some sort of, warrior or hero or, exceptionally strong, things like that. The parallels between the two are really kind of fascinating.
Exactly. And I think that's the interesting thing. We should come back to that because that is something that we're still talking about today, this sort of hybridized quality. Right. All right. So the other passage I want to read is from the book of Numbers. This is really the only other place it's mentioned in the Bible outside of some other non-canonical texts of the Bible. So in Numbers chapter 13, this is where Moses is basically deciding to send out some spies into the land of Canaan because he's bringing all these people. Remember, he took all these people out of Egypt. He's got to get them somewhere. So he's like, all right, go scout out this land of Canaan and let's see if maybe this is a good place for us to go. So these spies go out there and they gather intelligence. They come back and they talk to Moses and they kind of share what they have learned. And so what they say, this is Numbers chapter 13, verse 27. So they reported to him and said, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there, the Amalekites live in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." So Caleb's like, "We can do this," and whatever. Then the men had gone up with him and said, "We're not able to go up against these people, for they are stronger than we." And so they brought back this kind of unfavorable report of the land that they spied, saying that the land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim, and in parentheses it says the Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So that's a long passage, but just essentially to say they went up, they looked around, they saw these giant people, kind of with well-fortified towns and whatnot, and they gave a report back to Moses saying, "We're not sure we can take this land. We're really small by comparison to who they are." And the Nephilim are mentioned in this passage.
How would we even get to that point?
Yeah. How do you get from there to Bigfoot, right? I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that. I mean, all we really have here are giant, beings of giant size. But this is where it really gets interesting to me as I started looking into this more. And I think there are tie-ins to what we're seeing in the world today as well. And what I want to sort of throw out here as an umbrella to think about this is that we are still wrestling with the mysterious past of humanity. So the world we live in today, both the world that we know and the world that the people of the Bible knew, the world that preceded them and preceded us had a lot of mystery in it that was lost to time that they didn't understand, and just as we don't understand. So I find this interesting because this is a connection point between us and the people of the time of the Bible as well. And what I'm getting to here is that there were ancient megalithic structures throughout the world. I mean, we're all familiar with these, and they're the subject of, how many shows on the History Channel or whatever, these ancient megalithic structures that we're still puzzled by to this day. Well, they were puzzled by them as well. And what's the most logical thing you would conclude if you saw megalithic structures or remnants of megalithic structures in the land? You would think, well, I mean, I can't lift this, so therefore something bigger than me but like me would have lifted this and or created this.
Right.
So right then you have an instant, well, these must be giants that did whatever, that created these things.
To me, it seems like a lot of people that talk about this particular belief system in terms of Bigfoot take a lot of liberties and freedoms with the interpretations. And one of the main problems I have is the story of the flood. Is there anything to say that if Bigfoot are the Nephilim, they would have survived the flood?
Mm.
I know that in Genesis it says, they were there then and after. Is it talking about after the flood?
I think it is. I think that in those days, and when we look at that passage, the earth in those days, and then also afterward, it's really foreshadowing that flood is, it's on the way in the passage later on in the book. So, yes, there is a hint that these beings, these Nephilim, these fallen ones, are on the earth in some capacity. And, you bring up the flood story. That's a common part of most of the major myths in human history, is a flood of some kind. I was taught that was, more mythological, less literal, or if there was a flood, it wasn't global in nature. It was, some sort of localized flood that just impacted that region. The older that I've gotten, the more that I've, had experience and looked at these other stories, the more I tend to think that, there was some catastrophic flood that occurred, and that it got recorded in human history by the survivors. I don't know that the survivors were just descendants of Noah. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch, but clearly this event left an imprint on humanity, and we see it. We see the signs of that in all of these different traditions. I'm particularly interested in this fallen concept, because there's also ideas that the Nephilim are sort of fallen angels, or the progeny of fallen angels having intermarried or having children with human women. So there's some evidence in, for example, the book of Enoch that is not in the Bible. It's not in the canon, but there's mention in the book of Enoch that fallen angels, had children with women, and these were potentially these, hybrid beings. And you talked about hybrids before, so here we have that concept coming up again. But also what I mentioned, just not only when I talked about the umbrella concept about wrestling with our past, our human past not only contains mysteries in terms of structures, but there was a time in our human history where we lived with other kinds of humans, right? And this is something that I think modern humans typically just don't think very much about because we're the only humans that are here.
Right.
But if you look at history itself, there was a time where Homo sapiens lived alongside Neanderthals, lived alongside Denisovans, other species of human. So if you think about a lot of our mythology, it has these imprints of that complicated human family. And so you have really strong beings, you have really small beings, you have, all these different sort of flavors, varieties of humanoid beings. And that's, I think, a remnant of this time in our history, or ancient history, where we were really occupying the same space with these other human species.
Well, they often say whoever wins the war gets to write history, right?
That's it.
And obviously, modern humans survived. We won whenever it comes to those other types of humans. But it is interesting to note that we do have all this folklore about other humanoid beings that might be ways of people just talking about some of those other types of humans that once existed. Whenever it comes to even Bigfoot, over the years, on this continent at least, the descriptions of Bigfoot have changed. Whenever they were first being reported, the way that they were reported were mostly as wild humans, wild men, hairy men, things like that. And then you had the global discovery of the gorilla, and these other, as we started venturing farther out into the wilds and discovering new animals and creatures, and people started learning more about, great apes and primates and things like that, then the story of Bigfoot sightings, the descriptions in the newspapers and everything started to match that, and became more of, this mystery great ape. And then in the 70s, you get more and more science-based for the most part, and people start pursuing this thing as some sort of undiscovered primate. And now it seems to be going back into a supernatural realm where you have, this biblical belief, you have, the paranormal Bigfoot hopping through portals and cloaking itself and things of that nature, psychic abilities. Do you see a reflection of that in religious texts over the years as it comes forward? Is that par for the course whenever it comes to people's beliefs? because I'm under my own opinion that belief systems are oftentimes coping mechanisms, in a sense, to try and explain something that we don't have an explanation for. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think my perspective on it has also changed a little bit, over my life as well. So when I grew up, I was really looking at religion more purely from an allegorical standpoint. So these are stories that are helping us understand larger truths. They're not themselves actual true things, right? That's a very modern way of looking at texts from the Bible or any mythological, tradition. These are just myths, allegories, stories, right? They're not literal, but there are certainly others and many others who do look at these as literal things. And I never really shared that particular perspective, in part because I just sort of reflected on my own life experience, right? So if I were to, use some of the idioms of the day, and I were to put that into a letter to you, and let's say you were going to, have a podcast, and I was saying, Matt, good luck with that podcast, break a leg or whatever. And then 200 years from now, people were to look at this document, would they think I'm asking you to break your leg? I mean, they wouldn't understand potentially what it is I'm saying there. So just like that, as a simple example, that's happening with these ancient texts as well. There's so much context around these stories that really, quite frankly, is just lost to us. So we're doing the best we can by taking our own experience of life, both that and what we know about history, which we just talked about is a little bit fuzzy. And we're bringing that to bear on this material and hoping that we can glean from that some truth to it, right? So where I'm at now in thinking about these things is that there's really a blended quality to these texts, right? So yes, there are aspects of them that are allegorical. Yes, there are also aspects of them that are literal. It's really parsing between the two. That's the challenge. And I think because it's so difficult, we have to be willing to suspend our judgment, our snap judgment, into wanting to make it one or the other. I think we have to sort of kind of loosely hold both, that yes, this could be literally true, but it might not be. Yes, this could be allegorically true, but it might be literally true. So it's a challenge. And certainly, to your point, people's beliefs and perspectives do change over the years. And if you look at the history in the Bible, as the Bible, by the way, wasn't one single document for most of its history, but the understanding of the world does change in the text itself as you move into the New Testament. And we talked about Hellenism, that Greek culture. It has a huge influence on the New Testament. And it's written in the Greek language. But if you look at the New Testament and look at it from that perspective, you're going to see a lot of Greek influence throughout the text. And that changes the way you think about notions of what is God, what are demons, what are angels, what is the Messiah, what is the end of time. So all these things are going to change based on that cultural reference point, but some of them might still be literally true, right? So again, that's that weird suspension we have to have. It's just not easy to do.
Right. Cultural explanations, I think, play a huge part in the language, and trying to apply words of understanding to things that aren't understood can cause a lot of this stuff. And then, of course, something that's been argued and debated forever, just languages that don't translate properly, or opinions on translation. Mm-hmm. I mean, just take that passage about the spies, for instance. I had read where, it's kind of interpreted as these spies delivered bad information. as in this is bad news.
Right.
And then there's another interpretation that says, well, this Hebrew word was used and it actually means slander. So we believe that by bad, we mean lies, that it was untrue. So then you take that information. Well, it's either bad news because it was just bad news that they didn't want to hear, or it's bad news because it's lies and it's not true at all. And there weren't actually giants seen by the spies. But based on your own beliefs and what you're choosing to believe about Bigfoot, you could use either one of those interpretations to support your own argument for them either being these Nephilim or not being. And I think a lot of times that's done because just the idea of, I mean, we're doing a podcast about it right now. This Nephilim have become extremely popular in modern cryptid folklore. And we're talking about they're barely anything even mentioned in the Bible. There's not really information out there about them. And most of the information that I ever ran across, came from the stories from the Book of Enoch. And like you said, that's not canon. So whenever it comes to biblical canon and you got like the Book of Enoch, how does it fit in? And let's just go off the rails for a second and say all of this is actually true. Is this something like, does the Catholic Church really suppress and hide information and, things of this nature? Is that something that you believe that they would actually do? And like, why would they do that? Like, it's often speculated as to, the cover up of Bigfoot and UFOs and everything done by the government. But what if it's being covered up by the church? And is that something the church would do, and why?
Yeah, well, I'm of the opinion that all official truth from whatever organization you want to look at, whether that's the church or the state, is to a certain degree a kind of propaganda, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily saying that it's done in a nefarious way. I'm not saying there's some secret council, deciding, hey, we want to tell everyone that this is the truth when we know, us as secret keepers, we know it's something else entirely. I think it's a little bit less sinister than that. I think that we all have to wrestle with the fact that when we're looking at the world, we're born into a world that we sort of stumble into, and it functions in a certain way. And when we're thinking about how to explain it, we're going to have to cut some corners. We're going to have to say, I'm going to shave off this piece of experience. I'm going to shave off this piece, and I'm going to create this crafted object that is the truth. And we're going to kind of ignore the fact that these outliers don't really fit with whatever that object happens to be. So I think that the church and the state, they've absolutely done this. I think that I don't believe that they've done that necessarily in an evil, sinister way. There's just a byproduct of how we are in the world. And unfortunately, because of things like, we can talk about the pros and cons of this, but because of things like the written word, the printing press, we've placed a higher degree of importance on written material than spoken oral tradition kind of material, right? And that's interesting too, because in the ancient times, when writing wasn't everywhere, to write, you had to have means, you had to have skill, education, training. Like, it's not something that everybody could do and understand. So the spoken word, the oral tradition, is much more prominent in ancient world than it is for us today. And what that means is that people had to, by very nature, like, they had to have a deep ability to memorize and to listen and to hold oral tradition in their mind at all times. And we've actually kind of let that part of ourselves atrophy, right? So we marvel at people who can memorize, all these kinds of things. Well, I think that the ancients were much better at that. They could listen to someone give a speech, and they could hold all that content in their head way better than you and I can. And the person giving the speech also knows that they can do that. So how does that change the way that you're using language? I mean, it changes it quite a lot, because we with our written focus, we're going to go back and go, oh, here's a citation. Here, you said this on this day, and therefore, I'm not going to let you get off the hook on that because you said it on that day.
Right.
Whereas when you're doing this in an oral tradition sense, it's much more of a suspension, and you're playing with these ideas in a more living way, a more kind of active way than this. What we've taken is basically a very scientific approach to language. It's something very exact. It's something very quantifiable, precise. And interestingly enough, we brought that. If you come from a more of a fundamentalist perspective on the Bible, you're bringing that kind of scientific perspective to the text more so than that, sort of living document perspective. So it's just all very fascinating, and it absolutely, our perspectives change on these things. And if you're having an experience of a Bigfoot, you kind of have a couple of choices, right? One choice is, how do I fit this into a worldview that I already have, right?
Right.
The other choice is, how do I fit this into a worldview that I'm going to try and create, or I'm going to adopt, that is not what I have right now? Those are the two primary choices, and I think that's what we're seeing here. People that are proposing this Nephilim concept, they're wanting to fit it by any means necessary into this biblical worldview, not necessarily willing to adopt another one that might make better sense of it.
I totally agree with that. I think that happens with pretty much the majority of Bigfoot theories out there. Is the experience someone has and the way they interpret it is, again, a coping mechanism to make it fit into their worldview and their belief systems that already exist. And that's not to say that anyone is right or wrong. I'm certainly in no place to say that, no, this person's wrong and this person's right, because I don't think we know. I'm not sure we'll ever know. But Nephilim's not the only biblical thing that gets attributed to Bigfoot. Demons. This is another thing that has come up time and time again in Bigfoot, is the idea that Bigfoot are actually demons. And I know that this is something that has started to play out a little bit in the UFO world as well. Aliens being demonic entities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big one. Getting a lot of traction now. A very similar thing is happening. All right. So we're taking experiences that occur at the fringes of human perception and experience, things like Bigfoot, like UFOs, alien beings, whatever, insert. These are things that are not in common human experience. And we're thinking, what corollary can I think of here that happens in that fringe, shadowy space that I can kind of readily call? And that's going to be more often than not, in the West anyway, and some Eastern traditions as well, these demons. These are not things that occur in the light, quote unquote. They don't occur in waking experience. They occur in this shadowy realm. This we can use different words for that. We can use subconscious. We can use sort of hell as this subsurface world. Sheol is a word in the Bible that is this subsurface world. These are things happening below normal human experience. And so I think it makes a lot of sense why we would want to jump to that, because that's the only category that is supernatural that kind of maps into some of these fringe experiences. So if it's not happening where I can easily see it, if it's not willing to be seen and interact with us in an obvious, overt way, then it must be, by its very nature, sinister, dark, demonic, anti-human. So I think that's where we're going with this. And what I would say is we need to work to examine that perspective if that's something that we are jumping to. So we need to work hard to, I think, look at the evidence for that. What are the actual experiences that we're talking about, that we're mapping onto demons? Are they actually, if we look at those experiences themselves and the interactions that have been reported about the experiences, are there demonic qualities to those interactions? And here I'm not using the word demonic in a literal sense, but just in a, is it anti-human being? Is it a negative experience?
Right.
In many cases, it's not.
Just going back to that first story of the apostle meeting Cain, who's like, I'm here to destroy the souls of men and carry on a decent conversation.
Exactly.
It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I still, I remember getting so frustrated whenever I was younger because I don't know necessarily that it's anything new, but it was new to me, the idea that there were Christians out there who were trying to say that dinosaurs were just acts of Satan. Dinosaur fossils were just things created by Satan to make us think that dinosaurs used to exist, and they didn't actually ever exist. And I remember being so frustrated by that because I'm one of those people who's just like, well, I can see it, I can touch it, it's real, it exists, it's right here. But I think a lot of people want to live in one world, have this belief system, but, well, how can I include this other stuff that I'm interested in that, may kind of question some of the things that I believe? And so they look for ways to explain them and incorporate them, which seems to be the ongoing theme. And I think the belief that Bigfoot or aliens or any of these things are demons or demonic in nature is another way of doing that, another way of explaining it with an already existent belief system that you're not willing to stray away from. But you still want to play around in this pool too,
Right.
I was going to ask, something that I know you're constantly on top of and talking about, is the government coming forward and acknowledging, hey, aliens and UFOs are real. It's all over the news headlines and everything. Do you think that's something that the church, and by the church, I guess I'm talking about the Catholic Church. I assume that the Catholic Church is in charge of religion as we know it. Is that something that you ever think they will do? Do you think they will come forward and make an official statement or address these things that are happening?
I mean, I think that if the government does come forward with a more clear statement on this, then absolutely, the Catholic Church and other church leaders will respond in kind. And the question becomes is, how do they incorporate that information into their theological perspective? The Catholic Church has already stated in certain ways that if there are extraterrestrials or whatever, that they can be baptized and they can be Christian just like a human being can. So they're interesting just to imagine the
Crusades will rise again.
Exactly. Forget this new culture here. We're just going to fit you into ours. So they're making space for that, and I think this gets to your point, right, that you just made about the demons, and that's that how flexible or inflexible is your theological perspective. Because if it's incredibly rigid, then what you're going to do is you're going to say exactly what you pointed out, that this new reality doesn't conform or fit with my perspective on the way the world is and who God is and all these things. And therefore it's anti that. So what goes in the anti that bucket, that's, demons and Satan, it falls into that category, which, by the way, can be the bucket continues to grow the more things that we discover. You brought up the dinosaurs and things like that. Well, that goes into the bucket. You bring up things like other habitable worlds. Well, that might go into the bucket as a deception. Maybe we're the only habitable world. And I don't believe any of that stuff, so that goes into this bucket as well. So you can maintain that rigid perspective, or you can make room for it. And I think that's really what I'm trying to get at here, is that we have this choice, this opportunity to make room for experiences that occur in the world, or to reject them outright. And I get it. Rejecting them outright is in some ways easier, because you're not forced to sort of work through the complexities of having to incorporate this experience. You're just like keeping what you know, and it's safe. But I would encourage folks to try to do the opposite, to journey into that unknown a little bit more, be a little more flexible, and see what that will reveal to you about your core beliefs. And if your core beliefs are still strong, that's a good thing, right? Ultimately, that's a good thing. If your core beliefs change, well, that could be a good thing as well. It could be very transformative. I think that the religions of the world have elements within them that can easily adapt to this reality. And religion, by the way, has been adapting to reality every century. The more that we know about the world, et cetera, the more these theologies change. I don't see that changing at all. It will continue to do so. These theologies will just incorporate whatever this new reality is. But man, it's going to get a lot more complex if that happens. And I think it's going to cause a lot of people to really have some dark nights of the soul about what they believe, because you don't find explicit mention of these things in the religious text, at least in the way that we would want them to. And let's say they even show us a being at some point. If we see an actual being, man, won't that be a shock to the system?
Oh, geez.
So I don't know. We live in interesting times, my friend.
We do. Have you studied many other religions outside of Christianity?
A little bit. So I've studied a little bit of Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, a little bit of Islam, but not as much, and I've studied some Judaism as well. So, but most of my study has been in the Western religions.
Do similar items like the Nephilim and demons and everything pop up in those texts as well that you've noticed?
Well, yeah, in some respects. So there are mention of giants in Hindu scripture. There are certainly lots of mentions of demons, some of which could be construed to be similar to the Nephilim concept in these other traditions. I mean, in the Japanese religious history, there's a lot of demonology there. But I don't know how explicit they are, and certainly with like the qualities of the Bigfoot. I think that's what's kind of lacking in most of these accounts, is like that. When we're talking about giants and other traditions, they're usually like really, really tall, like way taller than a 9-foot Bigfoot or whatever.
Right.
And they're not talking about them being, crazy, hairy. They're just talking about them being just giant beings. So, yeah, it's interesting.
And the same thing goes in hand with the demon belief system. A lot of the properties that I understand about demons don't really play out in, like you were saying, in Bigfoot experiences. So it's kind of a contradiction there in beliefs. But I could be wrong.
No, but I mean, your point is really, really valid. I mean, if we're talking about demonic, I mean, they're not very good demons if that's what they are, right?
They hide from us. They don't communicate. And apparently whenever they do communicate, it's nice. So I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't really fit the mold there. But, what's interesting about that too, though, is that, people can also say that things that are highly persuasive or appear to be nice are actually not, right? So there's,
Right.
It's always interesting how people kind of bucket their experiences in terms of this is, sort of angelic or godly, and this over here is demonic or satanic or evil. What are the lines we're drawing there, and why are we drawing them? Sometimes it's completely arbitrary.
Yeah, I just saw a comment the other day about a person who was responding to somebody else had said something, and they were talking about, again, these things are evil. They try to lure children into the woods so they can take them. They, sexually assault livestock and kill dogs, and they're just pure evil. And then you have, on the flip side of that, people making comments about how, they're friendly forest giants. They're our friends. They're protectors of the earth. And then, again, you have the Nephilim demonic belief system. And all of these different viewpoints come in and just collide with one another constantly. And it's not just in the Bigfoot community. It's in all these different aspects of the unknown. Mm-hmm. It just comes across as coping mechanisms. That's the only, I know I keep on saying that, but it's the only thing that makes sense. Not everybody can be right. Not everybody can be wrong. And like you were saying, nobody's going to be completely right about any of it. And it's something that we really just have no grasp of understanding right now.
Right.
So, again, the whole point of this conversation was not to tell anybody that they're right or wrong, that Bigfoot aren't this or Bigfoot aren't that. It's just to have an open discussion about this particular train of thought and belief system and kind of break it down. So, Nathan, I appreciate you coming on and helping me do that with such a complicated and tangled up subject as this. I truly, truly appreciate it, sir.
My pleasure, Matt. This was a ton of fun. Hope you get to do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. If you have encountered something you can't explain, like Bigfoot or something else, email me at bigfootcrossroads@gmail.com. If you get a chance, check out the website, bigfootcrossroads.com. You can find links to social media, past episodes, merchandise, everything you need all in one place. And until next time, remember, there's something in the woods.